now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Mike Van Nieuwkerk, Senior Automotive Client Officer. Mike, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. Appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. This is our third installment of the Mobility Navigator series. If you were with us earlier in the year, we had one talk on electrification, a second talk on let's call it autonomous, semi-autonomous, and ADAS features. Today, we're looking into shared mobility. With me today, I've got my colleagues from the AMD practice here at Ipsos. So you have John Kaiser, who's the Executive Vice President. John really is our lead researcher in the space of product research in the automotive space, electrification, and was one of the founders of this particular study. Also with him is Graham Gordon. Graham is actually the study lead now. So most of the talk is going to be from them. Graham, if you can go to the next slide. I'm just going to go over quickly what we hope to share with you today. So this is a look at our agenda. John's going to start us out and do just a current outlook of what's happening in the area of shared mobility, some of the things that we find are really driving some of the research that you'll be seeing later on as we move through the agenda. John will also give a study overview. So he's going to kind of give you a sense of what is Mobility Navigator, all of its components, and then really focus in on this particular module focused on shared mobility. From there, I think John's going to hand it off to Graham. He's going to get into really the details of this particular portion of the Navigator study. And at the end, we'll kind of wrap it up, and then we'll have a little discussion at the end, sort of a shared perspective roundtables. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to John to start us off.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mike. You go on to the next slide, Graham. Ultimately, Mike was alluded to, just for context, we have covered a lot of different issues this year from our Navigator syndicator product. Starting in the spring, it was on EVs and specifically on the infrastructure concerns that we've revealed and identified what's happening in the US market, which was quite insightful. If you haven't seen it, take a look. Then in the summer, we had on driving technology, which included the autonomous ADAS as well as even the autonomous ride hailing, and a lot of cool information there to glean and certainly leverage. And then today we'll highlight the elements of the shared mobility, alternative modes of transportation. And so with that, we're going to dive right in. So ultimately, we would say here in the US, and we know this of living here in the US, is that the vehicle is king for most of us, right? That's just how we've been set up. But how do we really kind of supplant that personal vehicle? And you can just off the top of your head and kind of frame it, what are those things? And it's really about cost effectiveness. It's ultimately what we also say, aligning of these new shared mobility to your needs, availability, and that it's these modes are reliable and available for you as a substitute. And then another growing one is this options that are focused on sustainability and just enhancements there. So really through this lens of these four things that we're going to speak to the context of the market, so you can understand where our insights are coming from. And so if we go on to the next slide, first off, we think about the vehicle, and we all know this, vehicles are expensive, right? The trend, if anything, we'd say is getting worse. Doesn't mean people are going to ditch their cars per se, but it's ultimately we're seeing is cars are being held for a longer period of time. Of course, cars are very durable, dependable, reliable, so they can, because the makers are doing a great job with these vehicles. But ultimately, the upfront expense is significant, ongoing expense is significant, as well as for ultimately as relates to gas prices and just maintaining of the vehicles with all the technology that's in them, right? It just is expensive. But what we would say, you know, for most Americans, it's the real core choice is, you know, of course, the personal vehicle, and then public transportation is your only other real alternative. But the consumers are looking for other choices, looking for other solutions to help them with their transportation needs. So if we go on to the next slide, is we do see one of the key use cases of a vehicle is, running errands, right? Going and doing stuff, picking up something. It isn't just transportation of people, right? So we'll talk a lot today about transportation of people or our person, right, to get to point A to point B, but it's this idea of transportation of things. And since COVID, we have seen a growing dimension in the market, that is the delivery services, as it relates to whatever that is, if it's merchandise or it's food, it's like groceries, food, or just actual hot food, right? And a lot of this stuff is getting delivered, and so therefore consumers are taking less trips, right? They're not out and about doing these kind of errands or routines. So and most of us have utilized these services. I personally have. I mean, I use Amazon. Seems like we get packages delivered daily. Instacart is also very beneficial for groceries, and then of course the hot food, and then I even utilize HelloFresh in our household. So a variety of different options that are presented, and this I would expect to even grow further. So therefore, less actual trips being taken for these errands. So go on to the next slide. Then ultimately another thing that is impacting, I guess you could say, demand on transportation choices, that because at the transition from the pandemic, what we've seen is that there are more and more people working from home, inclusive of myself, right? And so not needing to do that commute, therefore I'm not out and about doing some of the different trips, the demands on mobility choices, because there's less trips to be done. But another thing that's interesting, and it's coined by Brookings here, they call it trip chaining, right? Where you're doing multiple things on a trip, like such as a commute, right? You might go pick up those groceries, you might pick up that medicine or that merchandise at Target or whatever, but those are happening less, so the needs are changing. So we would say, as the new mobility solutions that are coming out, it being flexible, being available for consumers, right, is key, and so that it's can adjust to the needs that we are seeing in the marketplace today. So go on to the next slide, and then we also seen this idea of sustainability, just this overall growth. Yes, we are seeing it covered in the press, what's transpiring with climate change and so forth. And so sustainability is getting a lot more, I guess you could say, coverage in the market as it relates to having solutions that will help support sustainability would certainly be advantageous. And we do see that solutions that are embracing this and could provide as an affordable alternative and be sustainable and be available could be a winning combination into the future. So if you go on to the next slide. So then you might say to yourself, like, okay, these all sound good, these things are happening, why aren't shared mobility services flourishing, right? We do see some negative press around some of these alternative modes, and we would say it's not for lack of trying of these different like cities and or solutions, but we are seeing some issues, right? Our cities have been built around that vehicle culture, right? You think of with parking lots and or not as many bike lanes or scooter lanes, right? But we also see that the way cities have been built is that it hasn't embraced it yet. It's going to take some time when you get the cooperation of city planners and with state legislator as it relates to building out different, I guess you could say, options would certainly be, I guess you could say, just takes time for that to evolve. And as that does evolve, it's making sure that we would say it's, I guess, embracing and being sustainable, of course. One other thing that was been in the press lately is you could talk about technology and just kind of work within the cities and the structure that's there, with robo-taxis. I know with a lot of coverage recently in the state of California, that's where I'm located, there's been some issues, and it's a matter of learning from that and adapting so that we can adhere to that complex environment that is set up in these cities. But nevertheless, it's a matter of embracing this and adjusting as we go and learn from our experiences. So if we go on to the next slide. And another element that we talk about is the vehicle, and when all this proliferation of transportation modes is evident, and they're out there, but vehicle ownership is actually up despite it being expensive, despite it being of all these other options. And so we are seeing this phenomenon is happening is because it is very flexible, is adaptable and so forth, can do different things. But nevertheless is that we would see as consumers own more vehicles at a greater rate, but they may not be using them as much and will leverage alternative modes of transportation as it fits their needs and for what they're desiring it to do. So nevertheless, it is something that is possible that with increased ownership, there could be we can contribute as vehicle owners to the, call it shared mobility by making your vehicle available through car sharing services like a Turo. If you have like an attractive vehicle, it certainly can be leveraged for those purposes. And we're seeing that growth and that proliferation happening as well. So that's encouraging. And go on to the next slide. If we think about mobility usage, the public transportation is a good measuring stick to understand what is transpiring. And we've looked at this information from since COVID at April of 2020. The proportion of usage of public transportation, as you can imagine, was dramatically dropped because of what transpired. And it's been increasingly getting back to where it was, but it's kind of plateaued. It's plateaued about 3/4 of the pre-pandemic levels. And I suspect that it's going to maintain at those levels. It's not going to surpass it because of the other elements raised, right? Where people aren't needing it as much or not commuting as much, right? That's going to cause that. But further, what's going to happen is when you have reduced ridership, there's going to be less budget allocated to those public transportation, and the public transportation won't be able to address some of their pitfalls. If you think about safety, you think about cleanliness, you think about routes and available routes to go, there's going to be less available. So therefore, that just really opens the door for alternative modes of transportation to take advantage of that, to provide an alignment to the needs of the consumer, if you will, on what they're after, and in particular, at the time of day and or your city or what have you. So nevertheless, that's a phenomenon that's happening. And if you go on to the next slide, speaking of the aspect of public transportation, we know it's more prolific in the urban areas, but we're seeing more growth in the suburbs. Medium to small cities are growing, and that's where those mobility options are fairly lean. So therefore, it's a matter of making some of those services available for where the population is and where the needs are. So that's where this idea, if we're able to build it, make those options available, can help with the increased utilization for consumers, so they can leverage that. So it is something to be looking at, something to be trying to take advantage of based off of the phenomena of the market as we go. If you go on to the next slide, you get into the diversity of the different mobility options that are out there, from personal options for hire solutions, whether it's actual, think of it, full services versus like you're riding them yourselves, or just leveraging more of public transportation or more long distance routes. So there is just a variety of options that are out there. They're building out from a variety of providers as well. So if you go on to the next slide, there are your, what we would say, your traditional automotive brands that are getting into this space, but there's also innovative mobility brands as well that are getting into space, offering different solutions and providing that for the consumer to leverage. And the main reason to really getting into this game is this idea of the financial upside. I mean, we've seen many different predictions of mobility as a service and its anticipated growth. In 2022, it's been estimated about a $4 billion market, but by 2030, less than a decade, it's expected to be over tenfold growth, up near $54 billion. And there's a lot to be had there as it relates to the market size. So that's why you're seeing this investment, you're seeing the support into it, because there are those needs. So nevertheless, we would say that those who invest in this space will certainly reap the benefit, certainly as they align to those broader, I guess, lens of things as it relates to being affordable, being available, as well as being what we would even say is sustainable, and ultimately is certainly going to be advantageous. So another element, we do touch on the idea of sustainability. That's one aspect, but then we also just think of ESG, this idea of the continued growth of these solutions is certainly going to be smart for business to invest in, because we see this getting more fully embraced by society. So offering these types of solutions that meets those broader needs is certainly going to be, I guess you could say, fit for most people. And what's I guess you could say needed in the marketplace. So something to think about, something to be aware of. And so with this context, we reference in how we look at this data for today in more depth. So if you go on to the next slide, like our framing of our study is from our navigator. If you go on further, we are focused on the shared mobility, and the highlight here is it's from 2,000 US GP consumers, or general population. So they're not necessarily all vehicle owners by any means, but nevertheless, they would have access to a vehicle, but we're talking to that general consumer to lean those insights. And this is from our 2023 solution, and ultimately in 2023 we do have a variety of mobility solutions that we've analyzed, a couple of new things this year for us to dig into, to understand. So there's a lot of richness that is sourced to be able to provide some of this overall trends and insights for our discussion today. But for those subscribers of our syndicated offering, they get the full access, if you will, get full information. If you are interested in that, just let us know, and we can obviously help you with that. But a key element that we've looked at this year across our modules is our sustainability segmentation. This is something that Ipsos has created, just helps us understand the attitudes of the consumer, from an activist to a disengaged to nihilist. There's a lot of information there. We're happy to follow up with it, but the key way of looking at it is on the next slide. It's just this level of engagement by level of concern and their overall size. This certainly is a beneficial lens on understanding of the consumer's choices, because it is ingrained into their attitudes, and as well as, of course, what we'd say what's available to them to utilize. But nevertheless, it has been very beneficial for us to leverage this, to be able to highlight it, and to provide those additional details. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Graham, and he can go into more of the richness of what we have so far today. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you, John. So we've got a lot of data here, and this is really just going to scratch the surface, especially this first section. It's about current mobility mode usage. And what we talk about in this specific section, we first are asking about the frequency of usage across all of those 21 mobility modes that you saw on the previous slide. So we're talking daily, weekly, monthly, a couple times a week, right? We've got a couple different ways to gauge how often people are using this. And what we see is that respondents stated that they were using these mobility modes on a monthly basis less than last year, from 88% to 82%. So people are using these vehicles, these personal vehicles, less often as a whole. And for that 8%, the personal vehicles are actually becoming more situational, right? The daily usage that we saw for personal vehicles was consistent year over year. So that means that the behaviors are changing for a specific type of person. And it could be definitely the type of person that is utilizing that delivery service or utilizing the meal kit, or the person that doesn't have the commute and is no longer trip chaining, right? It's a specific type of person that is using their vehicle less compared to last year. The other thing I will note is that the overall usage for all the other modes of transportation is also down year over year. There were a couple that I believe that were consistent, like ride hailing, but for the most part, people are traveling less. In this case, we're usually looking at metro and urban dwellers who had a monthly usage below 80% for their personal vehicle, whereas the suburban and rural dwellers were higher at 85%. And that also shows kind of a post-pandemic shift, right? Those that are commuting to work from their car, maybe in that rural and suburban environment, saw that little difference, but that the work from home or people in the urban environments are shifting their habits and using their vehicle less. That being said, the personal vehicle is still king when it comes to that preferred method of travel. I think our data is showing that the US isn't necessarily ready to ditch the flexibility and the convenience of a personal vehicle just yet. You can see that 92% state that their personal vehicle is their preferred method of travel. And this is definitely driven by older and rural people, those people that have a less of a desire or maybe less accessibility to anything else. And then the other thing we note looking at that sustainability segmentation is the highest figure we have across those 5 segments is an 84% preference for personal vehicle, and that's activists, right? So these people that are the most active in sustainability and the most concerned about sustainability are still using it at an almost 85% clip. So the personal vehicle is definitely still king, and John definitely alluded to that in his upfront section, and we definitely have the data to support that. The one thing that I can't necessarily get into here, but for our subscribers, you're going to see a wealth of data, is we also ask about specific trips for any of those mobility modes in which you're a monthly user. So we're talking about active users, right? And we ask a lot of topics about each of these trips. But one nugget that I did want to bring up for this webinar is the aspect of multimodality, the idea of using multiple modes of transportation in one trip to reach wherever you're going. And what we saw was if you are a personal vehicle user, odds are that's your only mode of transportation in the various trips that you're taking. And you can see that at 12%. Conversely, if you're utilizing something else within a specific trip, that frequency of multimodality is jumping up. So something like ride hailing, even at 17% is higher. But for a lot of that public transportation, we saw the higher figures in the 20s or even 30s and high 30s percentage of multimodality. So what we see is that these other transportation types, yes, that they're utilizing these other transportation types, but they also need additional ways to get to where they're going. And funnily enough, for a lot of these people, it's still using their personal vehicle. So there is prominence in multimodality if you're using especially public transportation. But it does give you a good baseline of how are people using these vehicles. And then again, for our full subscribers, we're talking about the purpose of the trip, the length of the trip, and a lot of other diagnostic information to unpack. So there is a lot to unpack, but I do want to get now into the next section, which is going to be talking about how people actually feel and view their mobility habits and options. And what we have is 2 main ideas covering this section. Number 1, how do people currently perceive their ability to get from place to place? And number 2, how do these mobility modes compare across each of these different ideas and metrics that you would actually define successful mobility? And I find this interesting because when we think about our ability to get from place to place, chances are we do, and you would think that these are all successful trips, right? But the reality is there's still dissatisfaction with how they actually can, whether it's accessibility or price or the traffic that they have to deal with. So overall, we see that 63% are satisfied with their current ability to get from point A to point B. And that's a 9 or a 10 on a 10-point scale, 63%. That's not great. There's an obvious need for better solutions. And you can definitely see that this is hurting, especially for younger and non-urban dwellers. But really, overall, you see this is something for a lot of people and for a myriad of reasons. Now, for those that said that they were unsatisfied, we asked them, what would improve your satisfaction? And we have this ipsos facto AI tool that we can actually digest those verbatims, and we're able to analyze their answers and boil it down to what we found were 5 key themes. For number 1, ownership is a main issue. A lot of people lean heavily on the public transportation, but they really want that ownership of a vehicle and something that fits their needs better and that flexibility. People are also obviously calling out improved public transportation. As John said up front, this is a sector that's been plagued with kind of this imperfect execution, and it isn't just in need of a facelift, but actual investment. When we're talking about the prices of transportation, whether it's car prices, gas prices, there's always surge pricing and ride hailing. There's a lot of money that's getting thrown around, which might be good for business for now, but it's hurting the consumer wallet, and that has consequences. So for a lot of people, economic factors was a key theme in their unsatisfaction. The fourth one is infrastructure. Much like public transportation, that's something that needs a bit of investment and public attention to it, whether it's actually, fixing roads or maybe even being friendlier to non-personal vehicle users, whether it's bike lanes or better bus routes, better parking lot systems. And then lastly, we've got safety and accessibility. Here, it's not necessarily talking accessibility as in like I have the options available, but more so I have the transportation options that fit my needs, right? Those that have the specialized accommodations like the disability-related transport. So that's really important, making sure it's safe and works to their benefit. That's really important to a decent chunk of our respondents. Now, to drill a bit deeper into those insights, I did want ipsos facto to look at the themes by location, because there is a difference in how urban dwellers would compare to suburban and rural dwellers in terms of how they get from point A to point B. And what you see is pretty clear here, first and foremost. For both of those urban sections, those metro dwellers, as we call them, they want better public transportation, they want eco-friendly vehicles. It's all about the space that they live within, the parking, the roads, the traffic. These all need to improve, right? I bet if I talk gridlock, they're all shuddering. And that makes sense to that specific core group of people. Now, for the suburban and rural respondents, it's a bit different. There's still a need for public transportation. And of course, we talked about that accessibility for those alternative modes. And there's a little bit of infrastructure as well there, but you can see that the personal vehicle is emphasized more here, right? As are gas prices. And that's the difference. Until there are more accessible options, they need their personal vehicle, and they're traveling those longer distances. It's not an issue of gridlock and congestion, but it's an issue that's still hurting their experience and hurting their wallets when they need something that's a bit cheaper and a bit more flexible to meet their needs. So we really thought that was interesting. If we're looking at how people are dissatisfied, when it comes to how they view each of these modes of transportation, where are the benefits and some of the pitfalls of each mobility mode specifically? And we do look at satisfaction across a bunch of different methods and metrics. You can see we have 10 here on your screen for each mobility mode. And again, this is asked just of people who are active users, those monthly users, so that we're not just talking about that one time that you used ride hailing. So what we see here is, again, the personal vehicle is still king. It's well-rounded in just about everything. It's getting first and second in all of the major categories: reliability, comfort, cleanliness, value. And a lot of that is because it's the standard of transportation, especially over the past century. So they're very keen on how they behave with that personal vehicle. However, the one place that we do see that it lacks compared to its quote-unquote competitors in the mobility space is environmental impact. And that's a big sustainability. That's the E in ESG. And there were 9 mobility modes that scored higher in environmental impact compared to personal vehicle, most of which are those personally owned vehicles like bikes or scooters, or obviously walking, which is going to have a better environmental impact. But there are even a few services that either use alternative modes like scooters, which are going to be better for the environment, or something like car sharing, which is using cars but in a much more sustainable way, right? You're sharing it with your community. So when looking at where to leverage these other shared mobility or other personally owned types of mobility, the environmental impact is where they can really make a difference and leverage that strength against something that's entrenched like a personal vehicle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't other ways for alternative mobility modes to become more mainstream and combat that preference for personal vehicles, right? It's not just environmental impact. If we look at ride hailing specifically, they ranked high in several categories. It's no longer a niche mode to people. This is something that people really use and find beneficial in a lot of different ways. It's second behind personal vehicle in comfort and safety, and a lot of that, much like the personal vehicle, comes with the familiarity and usage. People are using it and they're understanding the situations, so they're not putting themselves in the situations where it might not be the optimal mode of transportation to use in that situation. It's also good to note that car subscriptions were also high in safety, which obviously makes sense. It might not be as viable of an affordable option, but it's still an alternative to ownership for those that might not want it. So it's a good alternative in that way. And the last thing I want to note about these ratings and rankings, the public transportation, unfortunately, is not ranking well in these categories. The two more local alternatives, talking about local or city buses and the subways or trains, these were the lowest in the categories related to what I call the enjoyment or environment of transportation, right? The cleanliness, the relaxation, the safety, the comfort. It'll get you to where you want to go, but your environment is not going to be better than just about any other option at your disposal. They did have one top 10 ranked rating, and that was value for the price. So while it might not be the best experience, what we said before, it needs improvement, but it still provides a necessary cheap option, an accessible option. It serves this public good and is still good from a sustainability aspect, not so much from the environment side, but from the social side, giving everybody an accessible option to get from point A to point B if they have little other options. The last thing I want to talk about today is future interest in mobility. We talked a lot about the current outlook, but what about looking towards the future? Where is shared mobility actually going? And what we see is that personal vehicle interest is actually down. And uniquely, this is true for older drivers who are probably driving less or wanting to lower expenses. But it's also, across both urban and rural respondents. So there is this kind of glimmer of the changing winds, just with that slight decrease in interest year over year. Now, I don't want to bury the lead here. This is a slight decrease, and it's still way higher than just about every other mobility mode by a large margin. But the trend is heading in the right direction for those alternative mobility modes, right? If that's going to be decreasing, is there a little bit of wiggle room for those other mobility modes to take its place? And my answer to that is hypothetically, yeah, because interest in various mobility modes is up in a lot of different degrees. But what we see is three in particular that I want to call out. These three had double-digit increases in interest versus 2022, and that's astounding to me. That's a large increase for these types of mobility modes that are still kind of situational. All three of these are driven by younger consumers and those people that are maybe in the smaller urban environments or suburbanites. But the really interesting thing to me is that they all serve a different need. Bikes are providing that short distance travel within maybe your neighborhood or a nearby downtown. Ride hailing is kind of that catch-all. It's the more flexible one for those medium distances to various locations. And that long distance rail travel is talking about traveling across entire regions without needing to put miles on your car or splurge for an expensive flight. So again, just looking at this, there are ways for each of these types of mobility modes to leverage the situation that they've been put in and understand, who needs it and in what situation, in what environment. And then you can put your best foot forward in offering a solution that might not necessarily replace the personal vehicle overall, but provide an opportunity for a solution that's beneficial in that specific instance. And then when we're talking about kind of the future, more hypothetical mobility modes, this is a separate question that we ask, but we do see that the consideration is just about level year over year. We're talking things like robo-taxis, drone taxis, kind of modular transport, ultra high-speed rail, We talked about robotaxis specifically in our last webinar, as well as John was alluding to it up front. It is often in the news. So what we do see is that while consideration was flat year over year, the urbanites are not so interested, right? This is probably because, especially for robotaxis, they're seeing firsthand what it's like to have them in their communities. Whereas for suburban and rural communities, it's still this hypothetical for them. They might not have experienced it to the same degree, so they're not seeing it in their day-to-day lives or as interested in it in the news. The one thing I do want to note is I'm still pretty bullish on it. I think there are growing pains and pain points, but the robotaxis have definitely offered a unique mobility solution in those areas specifically. And it's been noticed. It is something that's going to continue to grow once we get past those pain points. Now, again, if interest is down for personal vehicle and interest is up for a lot of these alternative modes of transportation, this is a new question for this year. Who's willing to go further than that? Who's going to consider using these modes instead of their personal vehicle? Who's trying to ditch their personal vehicle in the next few years? And what we noticed was over half aren't opposed to the idea, and over a fourth of them are actually already considering it, some of which are actively looking at their options. So this is something that isn't necessarily a hypothetical. This is something that people are starting to really look into. These considerers are definitely younger and they live in those urban environments, which makes sense because that's where a lot of the alternative mobility can be utilized to the best of their abilities. And what we see, if we look at the sustainability habits of these people, the people that are considering it, those we call, the activists or the busy bystanders. Those are the people that are more active and engaged with sustainability. They're the ones that are most likely to consider supplanting their personal vehicle, both at 37%. The other three, who are less active and engaged and varying degrees of concern, they're less likely in that 20 to 24% range. So it's definitely a type of person that's looking into this. And we talked about, being younger and urban and definitely being an activist. But it does show the importance of sustainability in daily life for these people who make up, a fourth or two-fourths, or a fifth and two-fifths of our sustainability segments. So for those 27%, right, among those considerers who are thinking about replacing their personal vehicle, when asked about the main reason, climate change and high vehicle costs for those top two main reasons. Pragmatists who are very concerned but not necessarily active like an activist is, they're the most likely to cite these two reasons, and I believe activist is probably second. And for both of these, specifically climate change, that's really rooted in sustainability. It's helping the environment, which is obvious, but the high vehicle costs are also a bit of an accessibility issue. So those are concerned about where their dollar is going and how far they can stretch it. These are definitely the sustainable ideas that are pushing people to supplant their personal vehicle. And then, of course, for those other, the three-fourths, that 73% who are not considering about replacing their personal vehicle, the two main reasons that we saw was, number one, the freedom of movement, wanting to just be able to go when they want to go, and their current environment, right? So looking at that accessibility of being able to utilize the things at their disposal, 27% are stating that it's impossible to live in their current environment without a personal vehicle. It's really hard to redirect the flow of the waters if they're already entrenched in using that personal vehicle until you've given them something to look forward to alternatively. So the personal vehicle for these people, especially those rural dwellers at 36%, it's too flexible and it's too entrenched in their daily lives to give it up. Versus the suburban and medium small metro dwellers are the most concerned about their freedom of movement, right? So they're the ones that have a lot more places to go and need to use their personal vehicle or their mode of transportation of choice exactly when they need to. With that said, I think I've talked enough about the stats. I'll give it back to John and he can give us a little wrap up and then we'll go through our Q&A.
Sounds good. Thanks, Graham. So you can go on to the next slide, and ultimately we've got a lot of richness here, and really the recap here is this idea that we would say shared mobility has a way to go, but there is this optimistic future. Some of the things that Graham was touching on. We are seeing that the personal vehicles are becoming less attractive of that holistic solution. It's still the majority, of course, we're not going to ignore that, but as options and needs change slightly, that those situations where it's available certainly is going to be interested and attracted to consumers. And then we're also seeing that overall, there's still some work to be done as different shared mobility solutions being polished per need. We know that that's not the case because of the lack of availability and where that personal vehicle just becomes kind of that default mode of transportation when nothing else is available. So it's a matter of providing the options to consumers so that they can embrace and utilize different things. And then we did touch on this on the detail side, that overall mobility usage is down year over year. And as is even personal vehicle, and that's that total trips are down, right? But we still are seeing, again, that default of the personal vehicle is still that preferred method of travel because they haven't been necessarily given a better alternative, if you will. So therefore, we would say there is a need for those better mobility solutions to be expanded beyond just of the urban environment or the metro environment, right, to the suburbs and or rural even, because of those differing needs and what's out there. So it's not practical of all of the mobility modes to be out in that diversity of area, but there could be more investment there to certainly help, and we would say there's some upside. And we learn from that upside of that interest of the alternative modes, right? People are interested, they want to explore the different options, but it's about making them available to them. And as Graham touched on for this year, we touched on, and we're seeing 25% are, considering replacing of their vehicle. And that's, well, as modes, different things become available by other companies, that there is going to be some movement likely into the future of what's going to transpire. And then ultimately, that's been throughout our message today, the idea of the environmental impacts, right? We know that personal vehicles is contributing to that, and so there are alternatives. You've talked about our first I guess you could say webinar and module is on electrification, right? So that's one aspect, but having sustainable choices and solutions made available to consumers would certainly be advantageous, again, through that lens of having cost-effective solutions for the situation, aligning to those needs, making things available, certainly is going to be advantageous. And then, of course, the sustainability. That's our overall learnings and what we're seeing. Key information that we've highlighted here. And again, we're just what we would say scratch the surface. If you go on to the next slide, Graham, this is where, as a full subscriber, you get access to, of course, all of the modules that we talked about previously with electrification and driving technology, but then also the full US shared mobility information that we have. And it's great insights. Of course, the first two modules broader, of course, with 5 total countries, as well as just getting into the dynamics of what's happening as relates to the topic. So certainly is a great program. Certainly reach out to us if you have any questions or interest in that. Would certainly hook you up with that data. Next slide, the one thing I wanted to highlight is just the shameless plug, if you will, of what's happened recently. We talked and touched a bit on the ride hailing, autonomous ride hailing, that is. That came after our driver technology. We have a point of view on it. Graham had the opportunity to do a radio interview about it on the morning show in Detroit, which was certainly great opportunity to share that. So I would encourage you to take a listen. That's highlighted there, as well as we also have some additional richness from some qualitative focus groups we did through our automotives from Walt and Jeremiah, who led that. And it's really key is within our automotives, as you would get as a subscriber of the Navigator, you get timely, rich insights that is exploratory and insightful to give you reasons and explanations of why people are saying what they are, rather than just relying on the quantitative data we have. So a lot of richness there. Reach out to us. We're happy to help you and get you access to that information if you don't have it already. And so with that, I will hand it over to Mike for our roundtable so we could wrap up our session today. So with that, go ahead, Mike.
Hey, thanks, John. Thanks, Graham. As always, great information, great insights. So what we want to do now is we have a little bit of time left, and I've been kind of going through some of the questions that were submitted. There are a couple that I think we'll have time for that I thought were kind of interesting, so I'm just going to kind of offer it up. The nice thing about this roundtable that we do is we actually have three people, the three of us, that kind of represent different generations and sort of backgrounds. So it's curious always to see how we may align or differ in some of our thoughts. So I'm going to throw the first question out there, and this was really related to the topic of people using less, their vehicle less. Total trips are down, usage is down from the previous year. With that in mind, the question really is this kind of where we're headed? Like, is this the new normal? Will things sort of return to how it was? What are you guys' thoughts on that? And I guess I'll go to you first, John, since you're on my left.
All right, sure. And I kind of touched on it in the upfront. I do think I think we're going to see more, call it fractioned, trips and more single-purpose trips, if you will, because we have more options to us, where delivery of merchandise and food or even hot food, right? I see that happening more because as that becomes more and more available, right? So I think it's here to stay, and I think it's going to grow even further as that becomes more available to different cities in across the U.S. So I don't know if you think differently, Graham.
No, I think it'll be somewhere in the middle, because on one hand, people are starting to go back to work still in increasing amounts. Yes, the idea of working from home is still pretty prevalent. But we're seeing a bit of an ebb and flow with that. So John, to your point, I think there's going to be less trip chaining. So I do think it is going to be more singular reasons for transport. But what really should be happening is hopefully things settle in a place where you really decide where you need a personal vehicle and where you need X and where you need Y. And hopefully it'll be a bit more optimized, right? So if personal vehicle usage is going to be down, I'm hoping at some point that means that shared mobility or other modes of transportation will go up, rather than us just not traveling as much in the future. Great.
Interesting perspective from both of you. I think I come from yet an even different angle on this, and what I look at is, one, I think that we've learned as a society that working remotely is definitely an option that is going to be prevalent. Will it be the norm? Maybe, maybe not. But I think we've all learned, companies have learned that there is a place for that, and that can be utilized for its advantages. But I think another factor in here, and this probably affects people that are from older generations, which I happen to represent, and that is that there are economic factors here too that are driving this. So we went through an urban sprawl where we moved further and further away from the urban centers. And of course, we relied on vehicles to be able to commute back and forth for work and whatnot. With the economic conditions, gas prices being very high, there is a desire to minimize some of that impact. And some of that is going to be through, hey, I want to work from home more, or I want to kind of limit the number of drives I'm doing. So I think there's a balance here. I agree, John, that some of these new services and these offers, these conveniences, definitely are going to be leveraged and leveraged more often. That's going to cut down on drives. But I also think that unless we see a shift in sort of the economy that allows people to feel more confident and comfortable from an economic standpoint, I do think that driving could be suppressed a bit until we get there. So anyway, three really interesting perspectives, I think all valid. Last question I'm going to ask, because I know we're getting a little tight on time. I thought this was interesting as well. So we talked about sustainability in the presentation. I thought that was really interesting. And the question that was submitted was really, how much of a role does sustainability play into sort of the interest in or desirability of some of these other mobility choices outside of a vehicle? We'll start with you this time, Graham.
Well, I think the number one benefit that's going to push interest is the idea of accessibility. And again, that's not necessarily just I have the modes of transportation at my disposal, but also that it's the right modes of transportation for me. If I'm older or younger or disabled or in need of something particular for a particular need, or if it's, if it's cheap, right? People of all walks of life are going to need transportation in one way or another, and the vast majority of this shared mobility and alternative modes of transportation can help with that. I do think, though, that there is another secondary benefit when we're talking the E in ESG, the environment, is we talked in our first module about electrification and how consideration was kind of stagnant. And a lot of that is because of range anxiety and not knowing where to charge and stuff like that. A lot of that goes away when it's not your vehicle that you own, right? People are going to have no problem doing, a ride hailing with an electric vehicle, because they're not going to have to worry about the range anxiety or where to charge. It's just going to be one, 10 to 20 minute or 30-minute ride hailing gig, and then you're at your destination. So I think that's another way for sustainability to kind of rear its head within shared mobility, is it can almost help that widespread adoption of electric, whether it's scooter or vehicle, and get people into something more environmentally friendly.
Great. How about you, John? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I do think it, I kind of touched on, I do think it plays a key role as sustainability, and that I can't help but think of the environment aspect. I'm out in California, I think I've alluded to that, is I just recently this weekend experienced a vehicle which was actually, it was a motorcycle, gas motorcycle that was in the bike lane, and it was odd to me. And that's what shows what I'm seeing and what I'm exposed to. It was loud, it was smelly, and it was very disruptive. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Like, I've been exposed to so much electric bikes, electric scooters, obviously EVs as well, that looked odd to me. And I think as a society, as we see more and more of the more pleasant, I don't have the noise or call it smell or true pollution. It is more pleasant that you embrace it. It becomes more expected and becomes more normal, where that is abnormal, right? So I just thought that was interesting. As I was looking at it, I was like, wow, that's weird. I have not seen. It was like more of an older trail bike, if you will, that was in, and I'm like, what are you doing in that lane? That looked odd to me, but I just shows like where our society is today as relates to that evolution. So as we see more, it becomes more embraced, it's more expected because of the accessibility, utilization of these different, transportation modes. So I do believe it will be further embraced as it's more available, and then it kind of snowballs is basically how I would think of it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree in a couple of sense that certainly the more we experience it, the more that it's kind of part of our ecosystem, it's going to become more and more important. And sustainability, whether it's environmental or it's social, being social conscious or socially responsible, I think is definitely a factor that at least in our markets, we hear about and we're prioritizing more and more. I still believe, though, and again, this being a very vehicle focused, like a personal vehicle focused market, it comes down to still, not exclusively, but still mostly to convenience. And when I talk about convenience, I do talk about availability. I talk about affordability. I think those are very important factors to Americans. So sustainability is in the mix, but I still think it sort of sits back to my own personal convenience. So that comfort, that availability, affordability, and the aspect that was brought up also in the talk, which I think is very important, and that is safety, that I feel confident in that particular mode of transportation. So yeah, I think it's here to stay. I think that sustainability is an important factor. I still think it sits back behind convenience and sort of those various forms of definition. So, all right. No, we're kind of up against it. I appreciate everybody hanging with us. I thought this was a great talk, really interesting. For those that are subscribers to the Navigator Study, we thank you. We really appreciate it. For those that you aren't, as John mentioned earlier, we'd love to talk to you about it, see how we can show you the value it can really bring to your organization. So please reach out to any of us at any time. There will be a recording available of this, so if you want to review it, see it again, maybe review some of the stuff that was shared, that'll be available to you as well. So again, thank you for being a part of this. We look forward to doing this again with you coming next year when we go through the 3 modules again moving forward. And with that, I will say thank you and have a wonderful day.